I'm going to start with a story of we'll call it a horror story. It's not quite Halloween, but I was part of a small startup company here based out of Minneapolis making children's products, baby toys and baby accessories and things like that. And we did our own research trying to figure out how we could make this silicone part over in China. And it turned out to be a disaster. We had been promised, 6 to 8 weeks for the final part, what turned into almost 6 months of back and forth. The communication started to break down. We were promised things that we didn't ever see. Our documentation was blatantly ignored, and we had very detailed engineering drawings. Our material specifications were kind of ignored. There was things that were happening behind the scenes, changes to the mold, changes to the tools, changes to the overall kind of product's architecture, if you will. And none of this was discussed with us, and we would get samples kind of sporadically as the vendor felt like it was useful. And then they would ask for feedback, we'd give them feedback, and it just was a tailspin. And I promised myself I'd never source anything in China again. And here I am 4 years later, a proponent of sourcing in China and in Asia in general. I've been working with Josh Taylor at Product Evo, so maybe we can just do a brief introduction here. I'm Caleb Beinicke, CEO of Cove Design here, based out of Minneapolis. We're a product design and development company really focused on early stage concept exploration and rapid prototyping. We help customers develop ideas and concepts through to their first manufacturing models. And Josh, you want to give an introduction of yourself?
Yeah, I'm Josh Taylor, CEO of Product Evo. We kind of work on the next steps after Caleb. So we do product development and manufacturing over in Asia. We're a USA and China-based team who focuses on entrepreneurs, small businesses, and product teams in bigger companies, helping them predictably build and develop and manufacture products that their customers love. Our team's been working in China since 2003. And the last time I counted, we developed or helped develop over 1,000 new products, almost exclusively in Asia. So we're really passionate about helping people and companies who want to live bigger, draw outside the lines, and add massive value to the world through their products and their creativity. What we bring to the table is we provide clarity, proven processes, and a team of experts to help overcome the challenges that are inevitable in product development and help these teams and companies bring high quality products to market that really make an impact for the people that use them. And we're on a mission to help 3,000 entrepreneurs bring their new products to market and scale production by the year 2024. So it's aggressive, but we're making headway on that.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate that.
You bet.
So I prepared a list of questions for today, maybe as talking points or ideas for thought. And if we can just run through kind of the high level, you can provide answers, and we'll just keep this sort of a discussion. If anyone has any questions that they would like to interject, feel free and post them on the chat box, or we'll open it up for questions at the end.
Yeah, so, and I just chime in and add to that. I'll keep an eye on the chat box, as will Caleb. And we want to make this, especially where this is a smaller group, we can make this fairly interactive, or Caleb and I can really, go deep on some of the subjects we prepared. So it's whatever you guys want to make it, and we'll make sure to give you guys a ton of value.
Awesome. I'm just going to start with my questions, and everyone feel free to jump in as we go here. So Josh, in my line of work, we work with customers really at the early stage of their development, and they're wondering when is a good time to go to Asia sourcing. There's sort of two schools of thought here. One is we want to get Asia involved as soon as possible so they can get a lot of exposure to the early concept design and help sort of mold that concept. The other school of thought would be that we want to wait to go to China or to Asia until we have a stable product with a stable manufacturing line. We can sort of make that pivot later on. If you can give me pros and cons for both of those.
Yeah, there are pros and cons to both for sure. So Caleb, you could probably speak more to this, but I think the pro of keeping manufacturing in the early stages in America is the speed of development. You're working on the same time zone with people that speak your native language and have the same cultural expectations. And then you don't have any shipping costs or shipping delays time in transit to worry about. And so I think the iterative speed of development, especially in the beginning, is one of the biggest advantages you get manufacturing here in America. On the flip side, if you look at manufacturing in Asia, there can be some really big cost advantages to doing those initial prototypes in Asia. I usually recommend you start with the really early rapid prototypes here in America to at least get through the first few really obvious iteration rounds. But by the time you're really getting into a high fidelity prototype or works like prototype, for a lot of companies, it does make sense to take that to the Asian supplier that ultimately is going to build the product, because they can start working out the kinks really early on in what it's going to take to actually build that product at scale. So the trade-off is, even though there's maybe a cost advantage, usually you are going to add time to the overall development. Where you can make that up is, since that factory's been a part of that development process, usually the transition into that pilot manufacturing run is a lot more seamless and smooth. So again, a lot of pros and cons we can discuss there, but that's some of my thoughts. I don't know, Caleb, do you have anything more on that?
Yeah, so maybe you have sort of a rule of thumb. Is there anything that's better to do in China early? Let's say, for example, a printed circuit board or custom PCBA. I assume that may be a different margin going to China versus something that's more labor intensive, like a assembly process.
Yeah, and that's good. So like electronics, for example, it's the cost savings are probably smaller on electronics than some other things, because you're going to use typically an SMP machine is going to be mostly an automated process. Your cost of the components on the BOM for that circuit board, I mean, there is some cost savings in Asia, but we're talking smaller at that point, because at the end of the day, like it's a commodity, those individual components. There is some labor to set up those machines for the production run. There's labor required in testing and installing firmware and different things like that. So that's where you typically get more of the cost savings, is in that labor. On the other extreme of that would I think be apparel manufacturing, which is extremely labor intensive. And so the more labor intensive something is, the more cost advantage there is to taking it offshore. And then everything in between. I mean, we'll do complex assemblies out of plastic components, or even a PCBA that requires a housing and assembly. The more assembly, the more labor intensive it is, the bigger the margin you'll see moving it offshore.
Okay. That's good. That's good to know. I've heard about different strengths and weaknesses of different Asian countries. Could you explain a little bit about what countries or which regions are going to be better at what types of the development or manufacturing process?
Yeah, I'll speak really, really high level to this. So we do most of our manufacturing in China, because they tend to have a pretty broad spectrum of expertise in manufacturing, from apparel to high tech. If I've got to do anything with tighter tolerances or really high requirements, a lot of times I'll move that into Taiwan. Your cost of manufacturing in Taiwan is going to be maybe 10 to 15% higher than it is in China, just in general. Your lead times in Taiwan are going to be dramatically longer. So a lot of times in China, the factories will quote you like a 30 to 45 day lead time on production. In Taiwan, you're looking right now, because of the tariffs, probably 90 to 120 day minimum lead time on production. A lot of the Taiwanese companies really like to start working on product development a year in advance. So if it's a new product and not just a manufacturing run, you could be talking, 12 to 18 months versus 3 to 6 months in China for something comparable. But again, if it's higher precision, more high tech, a lot of times it makes sense, because the technology in Taiwan tends to be a little bit more sophisticated. The internal processes tend to be better. We can look at Korea. Korea is as advanced as anywhere I've come across. I mean, they really rival among the best manufacturing companies in the world, as does Japan. I'll kind of throw them in together. There's no real, from what I've seen, cost advantage in manufacturing in Korea. In fact, a lot of times it's going to cost you more to manufacture in Korea than it would to manufacture in America. And then you add in the time zone difference and different factors. The only reason I go to Korea is if there's a specific technology that you're looking for that you can't find in America that a Korean firm happens to have, and they do have some pretty cool stuff that they're able to do there. Vietnam is growing like crazy. It's typically the home of soft goods. So your cut and sew, your shoes, your footwear, but they're getting better and better at plastic injection molding. And we're seeing more Chinese firms develop sister companies in Vietnam, where it's a Chinese owned firm, but they're using Vietnamese labor. And they can be good. I haven't done any PCBA manufacturing in Vietnam, but we have done some injection molding and some apparel manufacturing, and they do good. Like they've really come a long way. And with the Chinese companies giving the oversight and the processes and the equipment and all the knowledge from the engineers, they can do a really good job. Vietnam, you'll typically add, similar to Taiwan, 10 to 15% on the cost. And you'll add, right now we're seeing probably 60 to 120-day lead times out of Vietnam. Part of the reason for that is they're relatively small countries, so they don't have a lot of their own natural resources. And so a lot of the raw materials are still going to have to come from China, be sourced in China, and then be produced and exported into Vietnam. So that just adds lead time to any development or manufacturing project. The big win of Taiwan or Vietnam right now is they don't have Trump's tariffs applied to them. So even though your overall cost of goods could be higher, your landed costs could still be competitive or lower than what China is right now. There's other companies like Malaysia that we're seeing a lot of injection molding to move to right now, but the projects I've competitively quoted, still the cost of goods in Malaysia is pretty high, and I've yet to find them be competitive enough for what we want to do, where we're working with smaller businesses. Perhaps at a really large volume, you could get really competitive in Malaysia, but most of our clients aren't that. So that's kind of a high level overview. I don't know if that's helpful. If you guys have questions, I'm seeing a few chime in. We'll try to circle back to those. But if you have questions specifically about that, let us know.
Can you just expand, for those that maybe aren't quite as familiar, you used a term called landed cost. Can you describe that a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, so that's an often overlooked part of manufacturing offshore. Is in America, if somebody quotes you, like, let's say a $10 unit cost, that's basically your cost. I mean, you might have to pay some ground shipping from one state to the other, but that's it. When you're looking at manufacturing offshore, obviously you've got to pay the cost of goods for the same unit cost, but then you've got to pay export tariffs and Chinese exporting fees, which are often included in the price if they quote you FOB. If they quote you Ex Works, then you do need to plan on paying those export costs in China. So FOB costs, they're fairly common for factories that do a lot of exporting to quote FOB to make your life easier. But then you still have to quote the cost of ocean cargo, and then once it lands in the ports here in America, you've got to pay your customs duties, your brokerage fees, your warehouse transfer fees, and everything to get it through customs. Then you've got to pay your ground transportation from the port, typically on the West Coast, to wherever your warehouse is. So it's important when you're doing a cost analysis to really take a look at what's the duty rate, what's the ground transportation cost, what's the ocean freight cost. And you got to think about how you're going to package these things, because when you're shipping on a container, it's volume based, not weight based. And so, a lot of people get themselves in trouble shipping really big units that are basically empty boxes, and you're paying to ship air. So if you can think of a creative way to nest products for shipping and transportation, there's a lot of cost advantages to putting a little bit of thought into that.
Is that something that, as designers and development engineers working on the front end, is that something that we do, or is that typically something the manufacturer is going to assist with in terms of designing for shipping?
Manufacturers almost never assist for that. They don't think about it. They just take whatever you give them and they say, we're going to build that.
Yeah.
Manufacturers, I mean, they're just like any of us. They're worried about their world. So if they see something that can make their world easier in terms of how it's going to work with their equipment or process, they'll give you feedback. one of the things I see a lot of people get themselves in trouble with is they don't think about shipping, and the factories sure don't think about it. In fact, we see so many products get damaged in transit because all the factory cares about is packaging that well enough to get it to the port. They're thinking about ground transportation. It's completely off their mind what it's going to look like by the time it gets to your warehouse. And even more so, even if that gets loaded onto an ocean container, which is a relatively secure way to ship something, if you're then taking it from your warehouse and dropping it in UPS to get to your final customer, I see a lot of products get damaged that way because they're just not packaged well enough. So that's something, Caleb, that typically your USA design team would need to really think about. How is it going to nest? How is it going to pack for shipping? Is that packaging that we're using going to be effective for the ocean leg of the journey? Is it going to be effective for that final individual unit leg of the journey out to your customers?
Mm-hmm. That's a good feedback. And actually, it begs a question that there's probably a volume threshold when it makes sense to amortize all those shipping costs, freight costs, import export costs, when those costs will have to be spread across a number of units. And if you're ordering, let's say 10 units, it probably doesn't make sense, right? But if you're ordering 10,000 or 100,000, there's a break point where it makes sense, and you can divide that out over the number of units that you have to sell.
Yeah. So let's I'm seeing a few questions come through here. Let's maybe take a minute and address a couple of these, just to give people some feedback. So Alicia asked, do you have an experience with selling a product or getting out to market? I have a product that we need to sell. So there's two ways I can look at that question. Yes, we have experience selling products to market. We've got our own brand that we sell out to market, and we've been a part of the marketing and distribution for a few other companies. But to kind of pull that full circle, no, currently we don't offer that to our customers. That's our focus is getting it to your warehouse, and then we can point you in the direction of some really good partners that can help you take that to market. But generally, that's where we end, where our service ends.
And can I ask you a quick question? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that. Are they brokers specifically that you would work with for, that you would send us to, or are they mostly like what kind of, because we've been coming across like brokers, a gamut of people, like, and it's so hard to trust, we're looking at so many different avenues, but I just don't know who to trust, I guess.
That's so big. So
yeah.
My answer would be, it really depends on your distribution strategy. So
Okay.
For example, if you're a direct-to-consumer brand that's going to focus on e-commerce via Shopify or something like that, I'd send you one direction. If you want to go direct-to-consumer via Amazon, I'd send you another direction. If you're trying to get into big box, which if you're working with a broker, that's typically to go into big box. So that's a fundamental component of your strategy, is getting into big box. Brokers can then be a viable, like very viable, if not necessary, part of that distribution strategy. But in terms of which broker to work with, I'll give you a very, very high level answer, and then maybe we can take it offline for a more specific answer. If you're going to work with, say, Walmart, I would work with a broker that specifically has offices and focuses on Bentonville, period, nothing else. Because those are the brokers that are typically in the offices of the Walmart buyers every single day. If you're going to work with Target, they'd better have their head office in Minneapolis. The brokers that kind of cover big swaths of the country tend to not have those relationships with big box as much. Another caveat is, like in the outdoor industry, one thing we see a lot is there's brokerage firms or direct sales companies that will independent rep your product into like the Western states. And that's when you're trying to get into all the independent mom and pop stores. High level, make sure they're excited about your product, like really excited about your product. Treat them as an investor. And if they're not willing to invest something in your company, meaning they're asking you to pay 100% of like their fixed cost minimum retainer and all the marketing and everything else, and you don't see them hungry enough for your product that they're willing to like give and take on that at least a little bit, I'd be weary. Because if those brokers or reps aren't really enthusiastic about your product, at the end of the day, they're not going to push it. They're typically working with a catalog of products, and yours is always going to be at the bottom, where if they have time in the meeting, they'll get to it. So that's high level advice, if that's helpful at all.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So the next question we had was from Hussein, and he said, what is the difference in willingness of manufacturers between USA and Asia to do prototyping development before production? Any other notable differences? So to answer this question, I think I'll let Caleb chime in for the USA manufacturers because he has more experience there, and then I'll give the kind of my thoughts on Asian manufacturers.
Yeah, so in terms of working with US suppliers, US manufacturers, again, US manufacturing is growing, especially with some of the tax subsidies and things from the government to drive more manufacturing here in the States. There's a lot of incentive for companies to take small manufacturing runs, in the 1,000 to 10,000 parts per year, where they wouldn't have had that incentive in years past. So some of these answers may be overly generic, but working with US suppliers, I have found that most of them, unless they're a contract manufacturer, generally don't want to get involved in the manufacturing development. They really want you to give them files that are ready to build. And by ready to build, that means they will tweak them slightly to fit their manufacturing processes. For instance, if I send them an injection molded part, they may tweak it to say, well, I don't have tooling to support this large of a part. We're going to split it in two parts, mold them. We're going to ultrasonically weld them together. We're going to deliver your part finished to you in your net state. That type of a decision is a design change that the manufacturers that I've worked with are happy to do. But they're not going to necessarily do the blue sky CAD design work for you. So if you bring them a pencil sketch on the back of an envelope, they will direct you to most manufacturers will direct you to a product design firm, which specializes in that, being sort of the liaison between a concept or an inventor or an idea and the first manufacturing models. Josh, maybe you can talk a little bit more about how the Asian manufacturers handle it.
Yeah, Asian manufacturers are a little bit different. They vary. There's some of the big, more established firms who are going to treat you a lot like the USA manufacturers that Caleb just described. Others, some of the more scrappier firms that are still up and coming, growing, sometimes totally competent, but hungrier for new work, are willing to do a blue sky concept where if you send them a sample, say, of a competitive product and you mark up the things you want to change, they would be willing to do that design and engineering work for you. However, there are trade-offs when you do that. The biggest one being if you allow the Chinese firm to develop and design your product for you, and they're doing the engineering and CAD work, and they're not charging you for that, you're going to pay for that somehow. There's a few ways you're going to pay for that. One is it could just be represented in the unit cost or the tooling cost. More often than not, they hold on to that IP, and that IP is now their IP since you didn't pay for it. And that means in the best case scenario, they're just going to hold on to those files because they don't want you to take those CAD files and then go competitively quote them at other factories, which is how they, hide some of that development cost in your unit cost. The other thing they could do is if things do start to go sideways with this factory, they have a pretty tight hold on you to strong arm you into staying with them and kind of slogging through some really tough, nasty problems that you're going through with them. Because again, you don't own your own IP. You can't simply take that CAD file to another factory. So there's pros and cons to that. Our blanket recommendation for our clients is to own their own engineering files. So it's how Caleb and I know each other is I strongly encourage our clients to do the development, the design work in the United States so that they maintain that controlled IP and we can competitively quote and we can pivot if we need to pivot. So is that helpful? I'm going to assume so. I think we got him on mute. So anyway, that's kind of high level.
I think that was a good one. And also you touched on IP control. Why don't we expand on that a little bit more? What other ways can we control IP working with Chinese factories besides just owning the CAD files?
Yeah, that's good. So I want to start with that by dispelling some common myths. So the common myth is that Chinese factories are all crooks and they're just going to take your IP and they're going to steal it, knock it off, and sell your product to whoever they want. And while there are bad actors in China, I find that there's bad actors everywhere. More often than not, I see honest entrepreneurs in China wanting to do good business between them and their clients. The most common way we see IP get knocked off is through other US firms, meaning your competitor sees the cool new product you just came out with. They buy your product, they send it to an unrelated Chinese firm that isn't your firm. They have them reverse engineer your product, manufacture with a few tweaks and start selling it, or if not, directly knock it off. So that's one really common way. And the reason that happens is Chinese firms typically don't have a marketing arm. And so there's no business case for them to go knock off your product and then try to market and sell it somewhere else. They care about manufacturing. If you don't have an order in hand and a cash down payment, they're not going to build it. The other thing we see happen occasionally is if you get in a fight with a factory and maybe the quality didn't come out exactly as you expected, and you reject the whole lot of the shipment. You've got to be really careful with what happens with those rejected units and probably have a good conversation with the factory ahead of time about what happens with rejected units. Because if you do, let's say, reject a whole lot, call it 5,000 units, that factory has lost a lot of money and they're now going to look at recovering that money. And so a lot of times we see products end up on Alibaba that way. And it's just the factory trying to pull their cash back out of it. So if you're not careful, it does sometimes make sense, even though it hurts and it doesn't feel fair. If you can't get guarantees that that product will be destroyed, so it can't be resold, it might make sense to just suck it up and buy that at a discount if you want to keep it off the market, especially if it's subpar and somebody does, like some of these FBA fulfilled by Amazon guys will come in and buy these cheap lots on Alibaba and put your product that didn't meet your quality spec on Amazon through their own sales channels. And the customer, at the end of the day, they don't know the difference. They don't care who they buy it from. They just know it has your name on it. So those are some of the ways that you've got to be careful. But in terms of preventing IP theft and IP issues, I like to think of it like what did Mary Poppins say? An ounce of, was this Mary Poppins? I don't know, whoever else, but it's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And more often than not, if you go in and really do your due diligence when you're working with a new factory and make sure you're dealing with honest people, that's step number one. Deal with people that have integrity. And if you're dealing with people that have an integrity, chances are you're never going to have IP issues. And then we'll go in and we'll put contracts in place with those people that already have integrity as the formality, so that if anything did go sideways, we still have some legal ramifications that we could enforce if necessary. But contracts are only worth the paper they're written on if you're not doing business with somebody that already has integrity, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. The Chinese courts, we're finding, are getting better and better at enforcing international claims against factories as long as those contracts are in place. But it's still an extremely costly solution to try to go to court internationally in China, hire a Chinese lawyer and deal with all that. So as often as you can, prevent, but do put those contracts in place just in case. I can go into sourcing a little bit and qualifying factories if it makes sense on some of the things we do.
I think it'd be really helpful, Josh, to hear that. Yes, exactly. How do you determine if a factory has integrity, and how do you decide, do we need to do factory audits? Do they have to be in-person audits? Do they have any sort of regulatory bodies that audit these companies and keep them to some standards? I mean, that might be helpful to hear.
Yeah. We typically do like a 5-phase audit process, and depending on the amount of the purchase order or the amount of the product we're about to order from the factory, we may go further into this process or not. But for sure, one thing we always do is competitive bidding. And so if it's a brand new thing that we're working on and we don't have a factory within our current network that is really well suited to manufacture that product, we've got to go find a new one. We'll get quotes sometimes from 10 to 12 new factories. And we start to build like a scatter point to chart with those prices that come in. And almost exclusively, we throw out the extremes, the outliers on the high and the low end. There's only been a few rare exceptions to that, and that's if somebody's coming in with the best price. I'll tell you a story. We did do one where we ended up going with the lowest price, but part of the reason we did that is the soft factors we're looking for. What are the qualities of questions that factory is asking us as we're going through the quoting process? Can I tell that they have an experienced and an intelligent engineering staff? Because if you're dealing with trading companies, which a lot of times is where these really low cost bids come in, they have no clue how to manufacture your product from a technical standpoint. They're just talking to their buddies at factories, getting quotes, probably missing some critical details about your product, which is why the quote's coming in so good and you can get surprises later on, but that's another story. But if the engagement's good, if you could tell you're working with an engineer that understands your product, they're asking thought-provoking questions, things that maybe you hadn't thought about, and their price happens to be good, that's worth considering. But again, 99% of the time I throw out the outliers. I kind of look towards the middle of where those quotes are coming in, and then I start to dig a little bit deeper. So our phase two is we have what we call a factory matrix. That's our own internal document where we score factories based on factors that we've found to really be critical in a factory being a successful partner long term. And some of those have to do with what's their communication style, how long have they been in business, do they have the equipment that we need, what's the competency of their engineering team, things like that. So we'll go score them on our own internal scale. If they pass that, we'll take them to the next step, which is often an in-person. Step 3 is our factory info sheet. So we'll send them over an info sheet that asks them about their banking information, the legal entity status of their factory, who the owners are, who the engineering team is, who the QC team is. And we just start to tease out, do they have a QC team? Do they have anything like an ISO 9001 certificate? Do they have any certifications? What's their floor plan look like? How many square feet? So we start to paint a better picture of them that way. Step 4 is our in-person visit. So I'll send one of my Chinese employees in person to do what we call a process audit. And that's where we take our specific product and we walk step by step through every single phase or every step of that manufacturing process. And we have them show us, okay, here's the raw materials intake. We look to see if they've got a QC team to inspect raw materials. And we say, okay, we'll take us to the cutting phase, and which is often the next step where they cut or prep raw materials. Okay, well, now take us to the next phase. Let's look at your equipment. And what that teases out is a lot of times you'll find out, well, hey, we've got this CNC step that's necessary for our product, but I don't see any CNC machines here. So then you can ask the question, well, who's doing the CNC? How's that getting done? And it's pretty normal for them to send that out, various parts of your production, to cooperated factories is what they call them, partner factories, to have certain steps done. If that step happens to be a really critical step of your manufacturing your product, I get really leery, because all of a sudden you're losing control. You no longer have direct communication about that critical step, and you're relying on their third-party suppliers. And the Chinese tend to trip over pennies or trip over dollars to pick up pennies. And so they'll switch suppliers like that if they can get 1 penny cheaper somewhere else. And so that's fine if it's non-critical, but if it's a critical aspect, we want to make sure that they've got that equipment and that step in-house. Then we document, okay, who their suppliers are right now. And we talk to them about how they're evaluating their suppliers, especially if it's even semi-critical. So that's our process audit. And then finally, if necessary, we'll pay a third-party inspection company to come in and do their own third-party audit of our factories. And we'll look at the differences between what we turned up during our audits and what the third-party company turned up their audits. And we'll use those to compare notes. And anything that we see is really significantly different just points us in the direction to go dig a little bit deeper on that to see why we came up with different answers about something. So those are some of the things we do that really help us find good partners that are trustworthy And a lot of that you guys can do on your own, other than maybe the process audit, because, you know, because of COVID, we can't travel right now. But everything else, a lot of that can be done indirectly over email, over WeChat, and you can even hire third-party companies to go audit. So long-winded answer, but hopefully that's helpful for you guys.
It's a really good answer. And I just wanted to chime in with a little story that sort of relates to this. And in this case, the customer was very leery about sending files to China. They didn't want to send their whole assembly to China, but we couldn't accept the costs that we were getting here in the US. And so we sort of had a hybrid approach where using an online manufacturing quoting portal such as mfg.com or ThomasNet, we were able to locate suppliers that provided these sort of key expensive processes that we couldn't justify doing here in the States. And we were able to parse our CAD file and chop it up in bits, and we could sort of send each part with inspection criteria to each of these factories, receive all the parts here in the States, and do the final minimal assembly. So in a way, we got sub-assemblies back here in the States, and we were able to then reduce the cost. Now that adds a lot of logistical overhead. It's easier to use a contract manufacturer who can button this all up for you and provide one completed assembly. But in some cases, whether it's for IP control or whether it's just one expensive process that we need to get done overseas, it's very labor intensive. Maybe it's a painting operation. Maybe we'll order a housing, for example, injection molded and painted over there and get it back here into our electronics in the US and do the last closing up the box here in the US. There's different ways to leverage and sort of, I call it a hybrid approach to manufacturing that way.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And I think depending on how secure your IP to be, that's a strategy we help a lot of our clients use. And sometimes that strategy makes total sense. There's other times when, you know, the realities of your IP is it's not that critical. And so I'd still recommend working with suppliers that you trust, but you could do an offshore contract manufacturer for the whole thing. So all viable options, and it really comes down to what's your product, what's your IP, what are your strategies, and let's figure out a solution that makes sense. So I did notice we had one other question that has to do with a related topic. It was from Alicia. She said, we have a product that we developed in the States. There are 5 different places we need to take the product to be fabricated. In order to streamline the fabrication, how do you know what factory in China would be best suited for your product? So I just saw the 5 different places, which I thought made it related to what you were bringing up. In terms of finding the factory, Alicia, I think a lot of what we had discussed just recently would be one good strategy to do it. There are products that even in China, I'm working with 2, 3, 4 independent manufacturing companies, and that's sometimes for logistical reasons, sometimes it's for technological reasons, and sometimes it's for IP reasons. But ultimately, if you do want to have a final completed unit shipped to you, you're going to need a factory that has assembly capabilities and good internal QC processes to do the final assembly. You can still work with 2 or 3 different factories, have them ship the sub-assemblies to the final assembly factory and then export from there. Or do what Caleb said, if it's IP sensitive, perhaps you have that final assembly factory here in America and have the sub-assemblies made overseas. So again, strategy has to do with your product specifically.
So we've alluded to a little bit the importance of selecting vendors that we trust and selecting vendors with integrity. But in terms of working with these companies, just in terms of logistics, right? There's several ways this can happen. I can go directly to a vendor or a manufacturer and I can communicate with them. But as Josh mentioned earlier, there's time zone issues. There's email versus video call. Different companies want to do different things. The time zone, the shipping, the lag. What's the best way, Josh, to handle the communication barriers, even language issues? Like there's a lot of barriers to successful development in China. Is the only solution a U.S.-based middleman, or is there other ways that this can happen?
it again depends, but I'll give you some best practices that we use internally with our company. And as much as you can, take them, use them yourself if you're going to work with an overseas manufacturer. But one of the things I'm constantly preaching to my team is a picture's worth 1,000 words. And that is especially true when you're dealing with language and cultural barriers. I've seen clients, and I get the emails from clients where they send me, nothing short of a small novel describing the things that they want to see happen. As an American native English speaker, sometimes it takes me a good hour sometimes to read through that email and really deeply comprehend what they're trying to ask. And it can take some back and forth. What I then do, what my team does, is we've gotten very good at learning how to communicate the critical essences of that email. So I'll take that email, I'll draw up a picture, and I'll call out like the 3 or 4 specific things. I'll get objective rather than subjective about the changes that I need to be made, and I'll send that off to the factory. So if my clients knew how much time they put into their huge long email and what that translated to, they'd probably cry. But the result is it's effective. We get the products changed in the way we need them to get changed. So that'd be one. Picture's worth 1,000 words. I'll give you guys a tool tip here that we use quite a bit. Let's see if I can share my screen. So I'm going to share my screen just momentarily. We use a product, I'll make this bigger, called Sketch. It's free software from Evernote. You can see this is one. This is not really IP sensitive. You can see I'll get right on here and I'll make a direct markup on things that need to change. So rather than describing this in words, I can come here, make a quick change here. Maybe it's an arrow or something. Oops, we'll make it an arrow, and then I'll just say 1 millimeter shorter, something like that. Very short, sweet, and objective. It's a very fast way to mark up pictures in order to communicate effectively. And the other thing you'll notice here, what my client said, what the email I got, is he said, this product doesn't quite fit in the assembly like I want. He's like, it's a little loose on top. That's what I got. So it took me drilling him and saying, okay, well, what does too loose mean? Where is that gap actually happening? And he's like, well, the gap's actually happening here. And then we got into the tolerances, and I said, I need you to measure it. I looked at the tolerances on the drawing and found out that we were slightly out of spec by 0.635 millimeters. And then I communicated to the factory exactly what we were out of spec and how to change that. So that would be the other part of really getting things done more effectively, is be very objective, meaning numbers, facts, figures that you can communicate to a factory, rather than subjective. So don't say this needs to be a little bigger. I get that all the time. This needs to be a little bigger. This needs to be a little wider. The color, I don't like the color. I think the color needs to be a little darker. That's meaningless. If you give a Chinese factory anything subjective, I can guarantee you with 100% certainty that they will get it wrong. They will interpret it wrong every time. So you've got to be very precise and very objective in how you communicate. When you do that, it's going to speed up the process of communication and changes dramatically over time.
That's a really good tip, Josh. I understand picture's worth 1,000 words, and sometimes all the words will just add confusion. I found, this is my engineering background coming out, I found that actually sending detailed documentation too early sometimes is actually inhibitive, because I felt like in order to send it, I had to have a revision on it, but the company wasn't quite happy with it yet. And so we ended up going through like 6 or 7 revisions before they even were happy with building the part as I had designed.
Yep.
So I've learned that even just sending them with a big draft watermark on there and say, this is a draft, we haven't agreed on this yet. And only until, once we go back and forth 6 or 7 times, it's many drafts, many revisions, until we're finally all happy. I'm making and owning the CAD file changes. They're reviewing, looking at the 3D CAD, looking at the 2D drawings, looking at my material callouts. Only then do I finally actually put a revision on it, when we build the first batch.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, if you send them too much information too quickly, they tend, like any human, this is not a Chinese unique thing, like any of us tend to focus on a few key things that are relevant to us, forget all the other details that are important, but not important to me, as the factory, and they send you something wrong. So as I'm going through, that process of building those first prototypes or getting to a documentation that they can sign off. I couldn't agree more. Keep it simple, get the feedback, and layer up. That's the other thing, man. I'm so glad you brought it up. With those long emails that I get from my customers, sometimes they wonder, well, why does it take a few days to get a response? Are you even doing anything? And what they don't realize is, in order to reduce the possibility for confusion, I'm taking their most critical point only, and I'm communicating only that and nothing else with the factory until I feel like there's back and forth communication where they understand that. And then I say, great, here's the next point. And then I get them to buy off on that. So I go point by point in a linear fashion and get them to buy off on everything, rather than saying, here's this whole dump of information, figure it out, and I'm going to cross my fingers and hope you didn't miss anything.
That's great. I've had personal experience with that as well. And I was the person talking directly to the manufacturer and sending a list of 20 points. And in my mind, I was very clear. I listed 20 points, and they would respond to the first one only, or maybe a couple of them, and they would ignore the rest. But in my mind, I had addressed them. And when we get our samples, those issues weren't addressed. So I totally agree wholeheartedly. That's very important, that over communication is good, but simplifying that communication is really powerful tool.
Yeah. Perfect.
Awesome.
So it looks like we've got about 9 minutes left, guys. I know Caleb and I do have a few other topics that we can jump into, but if any of you have follow-up questions, anything we've talked about, drop those in the chat. So we've got a few minutes still to cover them. And while we're waiting for those to come through, if there are any, we can jump on to the next topic.
Yes, so while we wait for any other questions, one thing that I've just learned about recently, and it's a very powerful method, I think, for reducing costs for startups, is having an Asian supplier take on some of the cost burden and amortizing the tooling cost out over a certain amount of units. So where in the US, they might ask for 50% of tooling up front and 50% of tooling on the first injection run. As a startup, we might be investing, $200,000 in a injection mold tooling. Or in China, they'll say, we'll just run the first 5,000 parts. You don't pay us for anything. You're going to pay a little bit more per part, and we're going to lock you in for, say, 50,000 or 100,000 units. How has that worked for you, Josh?
It can work good. In fact, it can be a brilliant solution in a lot of cases, especially to lower that barrier to entry and initial capital outlay for launching a new product. I would highly recommend that anybody working with an Asian factory have a very clear and candid conversation up front about the ownership of tooling and their method for costing that tooling out. The most common thing we see in China is they'll do a hybrid of what Caleb just explained, where they'll say, hey, your tooling cost is this. And sometimes it's still relatively high. It's, you could spend $40,000, $50,000 on tooling. Comparable tooling might cost you $70,000 to $100,000 here in America, but it's still, you're paying 40 to 50 grand. It's still a big chunk of capital that you got to spend. What they don't say, it's for them, it's the way they do business culturally. So they're not even aware that they need to explain this, but they are reducing that tooling cost a little bit in order to capture your business, because they know if they can build your tooling, they've probably got you as a customer for years for future manufacturing runs. The problem is, again, if things start to go sideways, they want to hold on to that tooling, and it can be a fight to get rid of it. The most common thing they'll do is they'll charge you a transfer fee for tooling, and that can be anywhere from 10 to 50% of that tooling cost. So if you spend 50 grand on tooling, transfer fees can run from $5,000 to $25,000. The other way to do that, if you really want to make sure you control your tooling 100%, is to go to an independent third-party tooling company that has nothing to do with your production factory. Make the tooling with them. You'll bear the full brunt of that tooling cost, but you 100% control and own that tooling. And then what Caleb described is a 100% amortized model. They're all fine. Like, all of those models work good. Most of our clients do that hybrid model. And the reason I tell them that is I actually like, in a lot of cases, I like my production factory to be the same factory that builds the tooling, because then they have ownership in it and they've got some responsibility to change it. If you do that completely off site and the parts don't come out just right in that tooling, they're just like, hey, not our problem. We didn't build that tooling, so go ship it back. And then it can get really expensive to do that. And the other thing is, as long as you know that there's a transfer fee and you agree on what that transfer fee percentage is up front, 99 times out of 100, you're probably not going to have to move that tooling if you've done your due diligence well. And so you just effectively save that money. But in the event that you do have to move that tooling, you still probably got a better deal on that tooling than if you built it independently somewhere else. Just plan on ponying up that cash, you know? And so chances are you save money. Worst case scenario, you're still probably lower cost overall investment than it had you built it at a third party. But you've got to know, frustration comes when you don't know what type of tooling agreement you've entered into and they slap you with this fee and you're like, what is going on? So that's my recommendation there.
Love that. And actually that brings up a really good point from a design and prototyping standpoint. First generation tools generally are not your final tools. So if you go and cut steel and make an injection mold, that's probably not going to be the final tool. You'll probably need 2 or 3 iterations where you're going to tweak the mold because your parts are coming out slightly warped or your fit is not quite right. And there's going to be design iterations purely from a manufacturing standpoint where your files might work very well on from 3D printed parts where everything's perfect. But as soon as we go to injection molding and the plastic starts pulling away, or you start getting some weird aberrations in your part that you don't expect, those are all material properties of molten plastic in a steel tool. And if their cooling isn't quite right, or if their injection parameter process controls aren't quite right, you may get differing results. And so moving that tooling back and forth between a tooling company and a manufacturer, Josh called it out exactly. If the manufacturer owns the tooling, they can more quickly and more cost effectively iterate on that tool. You might need to remove a little bit of metal to add a little plastic, maybe add a rib somewhere to get a little bit more stiffness, or tighten up the lip groove fit between 2 different parts. There's lots of capability if they can do it in-house.
Yep, totally agree.
Cool. So I'm not seeing any more questions on the chat. If anyone has any questions, feel free and post them up. Otherwise, I think it's been a really good discussion. I don't have any more prepared questions, but I think it's been a really good overview, brief overview of how to work with China, some of the things to look out for, some of the positives and negatives, things that can win from costing, simplifying your manufacturing line, and feel free and reach out to myself or Josh if you do have any questions at all. Happy to take those questions offline. Hop on a call and discuss your specific needs.
Yeah, if you guys want to reach me, you can go to our website. It's just productevo.io. My direct email is josh@productevo.io. Feel free to email me directly. Happy to take anything offline and give you really specific feedback and help in any way we can. But yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate y'all being here, and hopefully it was useful.
Absolutely. Yep. And you can reach out to me, Caleb, at cove.design, or my website, cove.design. It's been great talking to you guys, and look forward to the next one.
Yep. We'll see you.
Have a good
Bye,
week.
guys.